Whilst hopefully this is an exciting topic, I'm sure everyone's looking forward to getting going. But anyway, thank you. Okay, very briefly, reasons countries should be in the data gathering business. It's gratifying to note that a lot of the points I'm about to raise have actually already been covered in the sessions yesterday and today, so I will be brief. Again, what Wardle Armstrong does, you've seen that. Okay, so why should countries be in the data gathering business? What impact can it have? What data, what are the costs and conclusions? So why countries should be involved? The world has 196 countries. Those countries effectively are competing for investment. That's obviously the focus of this conference. And the challenge is what can African and Arabian countries do to attract investment that is attractive for them? What impact can mining have? Yesterday, I think, and today it was mentioned about the impacts of mining in Ghana. Ghana has actually surpassed South Africa now. I'm sure if you said 10 years ago, could that have happened, you probably wouldn't have bet on Ghana doing that, but it has. And clearly mining and exploration can jumpstart economies and act as catalysts for increased training and advancement of citizens. And just the one project that was mentioned in passing, Tolgoi, that project on its own in 2019 increased the GDP of Mongolia by 36%. So individual projects and mining in general can have massive economic effects in countries. This is taken from Mining IQ's website. So there's 548 projects listed over mainly West Africa. The countries in bold are countries that I personally think will still continue to have a fair bit of growth in the mining industry. That's just my own personal opinion. I could easily be wrong in there, and we've seen the focus on Nigeria. I think Nigeria is significantly underexplored, as are many countries in Africa. So what data do we need? The first thing, it's been mentioned before, the first three most important things in a mining project is mineral title, mineral title, mineral title. So there are some very good cadastral systems out there. There's a couple of examples there. So we first of all need to know who owns what and what ground is free. We need geophysical, geological, satellite imagery and drilling data. What else would I suggest? We need access to national databases, university staff, libraries of past explorers' data. And it perhaps is obvious, and there are countries that do provide this, but a mining code in English is very useful, obviously. And there are state and regional mineral resource surveys that have been completed. So what data? Geophysics. I'm going to go through very quickly. If anyone has questions, please ask me afterwards. Geophysics, geochemistry, satellite imagery, and geological mapping, and obviously the various forms of drilling. These data can provide companies with exploration targets, save lots of money, and importantly, time. What are the costs? Geophysics can be expensive, millions of dollars, or for, say, FTG surveys, and obviously depending upon the size. Geochemistry typically can be low, soil sampling $30 to $50, drilling sampling $15 a sample, but your XRF, I think I mentioned in my previous slide, can save a lot of money in terms of baseline, trying to target anomalous areas, and obviously satellite imagery mapping. Some of these are higher and some of these are lower. These are your typical drilling costs. So if a 150 metre hole could cost you $12,000 for RC, $22,000 for diamond, etc. Geological mapping typically can be very low. There are quite a bit of data out there, and I would encourage the representative of African countries to pressure BRGM and other countries to release the past historical data back to them. I think that's a real treasure trove of information. What are the costs to do some surveys of areas, or can be $50,000, $200,000. I mentioned before handheld XRFs being cheap. These are some examples that Wardell's been involved in. We actually did a survey of Zamfara State And these are some other examples that I'll just quickly run through, but you can see yourself, so rather than waste any time. So what are the conclusions? There are low-cost methods that can be adopted to drive geological projects. Lower cost technology, as I mentioned earlier, handheld XRF machines. If a country can access funds to drive mining, this can directly impact investments, jobs, development, and often it's in remote parts of the country that can help development. What are the advantages? The data is always valuable, even potentially decades later, and obviously there are royalties there. That's my presentation, so we'll move quickly into the discussion. Thank you, everybody. Perhaps I could ask the first question. Oh, excuse me. If I could ask the first question of Jeff. Would you see any appetite, whether it's from the US or World Bank or UN, or perhaps even within regional banks in Africa, for them to collaborate, given the fact that, say, you have Birmingham belts going across countries, for them to collaborate and drive down costs and collectively obtain data?
Yes, absolutely. And I think, particularly the World Bank, I think the World Bank understood the importance of this and has for some time. I think most recently in West Africa, where they've supported large regional airborne geophysical surveys, they've understood the importance of these very fundamental large regional databases that underpin an understanding of the geology and mineral resource potential of a region. So absolutely, I think there's lots of opportunity for collaboration between development banks and countries throughout Africa.
Anthony, if you were the Minister of Mines in a particular country and you had $2 million spare to help provide to develop exploration in that country, what would you spend it on?
Okay, so I think $2 million will buy you a reasonably decent geophysical survey, airborne geophysical survey over a reasonable area. So I would probably spend it on that, and then making sure that the data was properly QA/QC'd, obviously, made available free of charge to whoever wants it, in all honesty. I think one of the themes of the conference has been the availability of geodata. I know Jeff mentioned it yesterday in his talk, and I completely concur with everything that Jeff was saying. And I'm sure that as geologists we would all agree that geodata is absolutely fundamental and one of the first thing that any exploration company looks for when it goes into a new jurisdiction. And without that data, they'll go elsewhere. But if I may just expand on my answer for a second, I think, and perhaps, forgive me, you may go on to this later on, when geologists talk about geodata, we know what we want. We want not just a scanned PDF document of something. We want data to be ideally in the right format. So, and the right format, of course, means digital shapefiles. It means databases. It means Excel spreadsheets. It means something that you can use in your own systems to do your own research, your own exploration. I think, and that distinction as to what data is and why it's important, it is getting through, but I still think it needs to be reinforced at every opportunity that we've got. So, short answer to your question, airborne geophysics.
Thank you for that. Chris, would you answer the same question?
Yeah, geophysics is good, but there's a lot of other data as well which you could probably get more bang for your buck with. Satellite imagery, a lot of satellites up there, and the cost of that's getting cheaper and cheaper. Once you've got the satellite imagery, you can interpret it. Another one that is also possible with satellites is elevation data, DEM, DTM data. I mean, a project I was working on recently, we had to buy the satellite imagery, but we acquired the elevation data as well, and we took it. We early stage exploration project with meter resolution elevation data. We had a survey crew coming in anyway. We had to tie in a couple of base points, but that was incredible value for money, and really got the project moving quite well. So yeah, I do agree with Anthony that geophysics is fantastic in terms of what you can pick up out of it, but there's other data out there as well that can be really useful.
Within many countries, there is the requirement to maintain your license in good standing, to submit quarterly or annual reports, and sometimes the requirements of what should be in that report isn't well defined. So sometimes you just have to say we drilled so many holes and these are the top 5 assay results. How much data do you think companies should be forced to give to the government, given the fact that, without naming any, some mining departments have perhaps been a bit leaky with data, shall we say? I'll start with Chris and then work on the panel.
Yeah, I mean, you've got a cross section here. I mean, I work on the industry side of it, and I mean, yes, you have to give the governments enough data so that you satisfy them that you're doing the job professionally. A lot of companies wouldn't want to give too much away because I mean, yeah, there are jurisdictions that are more leaky than others.
Sure. And there's also legal requirements to disclose data timeously or not. So they're also bound perhaps by the jurisdictions they're listed in as also.
No, that's correct. I mean, a lot of jurisdictions, certainly if you get up to a feasibility stage where you're going to actually go down the road of opening a mine, the government at that stage is usually going to be a partner with some sort of percentage in it. At that stage, yeah, there's probably a higher obligation for the company to put all the data on the table, because the government itself, particularly if they've got lawyers or consultants doing the due diligence on their side, they're going to want to see the data. Earlier stage exploration, I mean, from an industry side, perhaps a lot of companies would want to give less away. If you've made a really good discovery, yes, you probably want to keep that relatively quiet. And there's a lot of artisanal miners who would love to know where the latest hot gold discovery is, and a lot of companies that would probably not want the artisanals to find it.
Sure. In my experience, it often works the other way around. You follow the artisanal miners; they will actually tell you where some of the good intercepts are. So it can go both ways. But thank you. Sorry, Jeff. Same question.
You want a government perspective, obviously. So, well, I mean, so the government perspective is, what does the government plan to do with that information? So, I mean, for example, there is the Australian example, I guess, where companies are obliged to provide all their exploration or relevant data, and the government, there's an understanding there that will be kept proprietary for, I think it's a five-year period, and then becomes public information. So there's an understanding, a trust, if you will, which I think is very important.
Great, thank you. And lastly, Anthony, and then I'll open the questions up.
So from a consultant's point of view, obviously we would want to see as much data as we could be readily available from the government from previous exploration campaigns that we could use in our studies. But I concur with the argument of saying that the problem is, of course, there's this underlying fear that anything that you submit to the government may ultimately enter into the public domain, regardless of confidentiality clauses or whatever. So I do sympathise with exploration companies with their dilemma. They have a legal responsibility to submit various types of information, but they may be reluctant to do so because of the danger that it may leak out and jeopardise their future work. But from a consultant's perspective, I'm all for making as much information available as possible, of course.
Sure. For those of you, I'm sure nobody really knows, but Anthony and I used to work basically for the same company over 20 years ago in South Africa for Goldfields, and Goldfields, like many South African companies, that was in the old paradigm where you could hold on to mineral licenses literally for decades, and obviously with the change in government, end of apartheid, it became very much use it or lose it. So there was very much a culture of holding back data, and if you dared to share data with anyone, you were, dismissible offence. So the expectation to share data is changing. I think that's ultimately a good thing. I think the approach in Australia to have the data on a moratorium will protect both sides. So that's perhaps a good step to go, or halfway. Perhaps I can open up any questions from the audience. Deafening silence. I think everybody's looking forward to getting home. Before I close it, is there any question that you three would like to ask each other or myself?
I mean, it's not a question, more a plea in some ways, because there's a lot of old data out there. I mean, the USGS, say back in the 70s and 80s, have done huge amounts of work. A lot of that's pre-computer, modern sort of technology. Soviets in various countries in Africa did some amazing amounts of survey work. I mean, we've heard the DRC mentioned a couple of times. I mean, the old Belgian mines. There's a huge amount of data floating around, which isn't really available. It's not in a digital format, but a lot of that data and a lot of our predecessors who collected that data were phenomenally good professionals, and there's real value in that data. And I think that's the one thing I feel we're potentially going to miss. A lot of countries are going to miss an opportunity is archiving that data, but actually using that data as part of the geological data sets going forward.
If I could add to that, I've been working on a heavy mineral sands project in West Africa, where there was actually a lot of very good work by the Soviets done in the 1970s, and more recently by BIGM. So I'd definitely encourage the West African countries to politely request those data, and for those to, as you quite rightly said, to be collated. Anthony, you want something? I think we do actually have a question from the audience. If 1 second, sorry.
Okay. It's a comment really rather than a question to pose anybody, but I suppose my observations from this conference and others I've attended recently, I'd say generally I'm slightly more positive than I was before in hearing the positive messages from the governments, particularly in the African region, who are saying publicly now that they do understand the importance of making data freely available. Perhaps not for free, but at least freely available in some form or another. And that is the right message that we need to get out there. It's interesting actually, because it contrasts quite a lot with a lot of work that I do in Central Asia, where the mentality of the former Soviet Union is totally different and is still very much knowledge is power, and I am not willing to share anything because by sharing information I am undermining my own position. And it's actually refreshing to come to an event like this where the information is actually understood to be important to be shared, because if you've got information and nobody knows about it, or only 1 or 2 people know about it, you may as well not have it in the first place. There's no point of having data that is not being used. So I'm encouraged by hearing the messages from governments, from ministries, saying that they acknowledge the importance of getting this data out there. And I only wish that other parts of the world actually have the same forward thinking.
Yeah, thank you.
Actually, my question follows on from Anthony's statement. Because the panel is called Obtaining and Marketing Geological Data, and we've talked a lot about obtaining, but not much about marketing. So how do you effectively market geological data that you get in a way that will attract investors into a country?
If I could maybe start, well, I think the key piece of information that will drive any exploration program is the mineral tenure. So I think there are countries that have that information readily available on cadastral systems, and they update it on a daily basis, and you can see who the owner is, when it was granted, when it's going to expire significantly, and what elements are there, and the files. Perhaps something that those countries that do have cadastral systems, it might be great if there was a click on a mineral block polygon and export it, as Anthony mentioned earlier, to a shapefile, or have that readily available or saleable. So that's the first piece of information. And Jeff, are you going to comment next?
I would perhaps take exception to the term marketing. I think the best way to market, if that's the term we use, is to make it openly and freely available. I think you really have to think of this in terms of return on investment. We just showed some examples of what it would cost to collect some of this geoscience data. Millions, tens of millions perhaps, for a very large collection of data. But think about the return on that investment. The exploration that would generate one discovery, we could be talking hundreds of millions and billions of dollars. So that's, I think, how one needs to be thinking about making your data available for the world to see. I think of it in terms of crowdsourcing. If you're going to keep this data closed hold and only allow a selected few to look at it, sell it to them, whatever you want to do, first of all, you don't know whether those are really the best people to be looking at the data. If you make it freely available to the entire global exploration community, somebody out there is going to see something in that data that they have seen somewhere else. Exploration and assessment of mineral resources is all about analogy. And so when you get experienced people who have worked throughout the world, they're going to see something in your data that means something, and that's going to attract them into your industry. And so I would highly encourage you to market your data and make it openly and freely accessible.
It is interesting that some of the lithium moves in Cornwall, where I actually stay, where my office is, some of that information comes from reports 50, 70, 100 years ago. So there are a lot of resources out there, but it is a bit of a hunting for a needle in a haystack. So I think there is freely available data here in the UK about other parts of the world. And I think that, the other side of the coin, as well as countries marketing their projects, companies have to do so as well. So there are the ASX, the TSX announcements, and people can and do spend lots of time and money collating that, putting it together, and then selling it. But yeah, I think more could be done. Comments?
Yeah, couple of things to I think one of them is who owns the data, say on a big geophysical survey. What was it, World Bank or the UN? In which case that data should probably be freely available. Was it the country itself? At which point perhaps the country might want to charge for access to that data, and that sort of leads on to my next point, which is there's a big difference in the way the hydrocarbon industry does its licensing and the minerals industry does. I mean, a hydrocarbon licensing round, the blocks are available, they're defined. There's an access price that a company would pay to actually access the data available on that block. Mining industry doesn't do it quite the same way. It tends to be the other way around. You apply for the block and then you have to find out what data is available. But certainly one option that would be really nice, and I'm not sure that it actually happens anywhere in the world, would be a bidding round where all the geological data was available. And I think a lot of mining companies would be prepared to put some money on the table if that scenario actually existed.
Sure, I'm sure you're right. It was mentioned in passing yesterday, the TELUS Northern Ireland, and there's also a TELUS Southwest program. For those of you who don't know, those were quite large geophysical programs where radiometrics and it was either gravity or magnetics, and I forget which. I think it was magnetics, and LiDAR data was gathered. In conjunction with that, certainly down in Cornwall, there is, I think it's called the GBASE geochemical survey that's been going on in the UK for 20 years, I think. And all of that data is basically freely available because it was, certainly the TELUS data, because it was NERC funded. And one of the foundational principles of that is if they fund it, it has to be freely available. But I think those points are well made.
Yeah, and as I think I tried to show yesterday, just the making that data available did stir exploration in the region. And to your point, you could have the best data available and make it accessible, and unless you have all these other ingredients in place, a stable political, economic, or political situation, internationally competitive mining legislation, infrastructure, all those things, the data itself is not going to make much of a difference. And I bring up Afghanistan as one example where we have spent years collecting and compiling and making available a tremendous amount of information for the country of Afghanistan, freely available on the web. We put data packages together for a potential bidding process, and not a whole lot of interest in going to Afghanistan, but there's a tremendous amount of data. So, you need all the ingredients to make it work.
Sure, and I think the next step also is, once you've got the data, what do you do with it? You need geoscientists to manipulate the data, pull it all into 3D modeling packages or GIS packages. There are the skills out there in West Africa and Arabia. There's lots of very good technical GIS people, and getting those insights. And as you mentioned earlier, I've seen this somewhere else before. Applying that knowledge to the new data. Go ahead, Hans.
Well, it was just more or less agreeing with, again, what Jeff was saying earlier on. I think, referring back to Roz's question about marketing geodata, I think the best form of marketing, in my opinion, is to advertise that you've got the data available for free, is by attending events like this, is making big splashes in presentations or conferences, giving away your data on USB sticks or however you want to do it. Just get it out there. That's what people really want. They want to be able to get the data as easy as possible. And leading back to your opening comment on your presentation, countries need to realise it is a competitive market out there. If companies can't acquire this data easily, they'll go somewhere else. They really will. Why should junior exploration companies find it so difficult to acquire baseline, regional scale, digital geological mapping, for example? It shouldn't be that difficult. It really shouldn't. If it's hard for a company to acquire that data, they're going to look somewhere where it's a lot easier to do so. I take on board Jeff's comments about the geodata is only one of those sort of pillars, if you like, that is important in any jurisdiction. Security of tenure, obviously, is very important. A stable legislative and fiscal regime, equally important. But as geoscientists, we're sitting here, we know the value of geodata, and the best way of advertising the existence of that data is by giving it away, is by however you want to do it, on a website, a USB stick, send out CDs, who cares? Just get it out there. The more people that see the data, the more it's likely to be used effectively, and that people can draw analogies to other examples of places that they've seen in the past.
And thank you. I think unless there's any final questions, I'll close just with a couple of maybe comments. In finding and developing a mine, it's a rule of thumb that typically the third company finds the mine. So you get one company comes along, spends $5 million, walks away, and the second one and the third one. So this isn't a very quick or cheap process. To develop a mine from finding a piece of mineralized outcrop on the ground to actually developing a mine can typically take 7 to 15 years. So it is a long process. It is a risky process. And I think just going back, data is expensive to acquire, and I think it can always have value. A geophysical map is still valid in 10 years' time, in 15 years' time. You may want the raw data, as Anthony mentioned, to reprocess it, to reinterpret it, rather than just a PDF map, which is still better than nothing. But it's always valuable. So keep your data in a library or a repository, and share it. I'd like to personally thank the organisers for this conference. The food was very tasty and not too much, so we didn't all fall asleep after lunch, so thank you for that. Thank you to my panellists, and thank you to you, the audience, and all the honourable members who were here and been gone. And I don't know if you want to close the meeting. Thank you very much, everyone.